Spider-Man the Animated Series wasn't just another 90s cartoon. It was a bold, boundary-pushing masterpiece disguised as just another fun cartoon. But what if I told you the web slinger you thought you knew was tangled in a web of censorship, nightmares, cutthroat studio politics, and behind-the-scenes chaos that almost destroyed the show before it could even get off the ground? From shocking character restrictions to a finale that was anything but final. The truth behind this fan-favorite series is way darker than you think. And by the time we're done, you'll never look at Spider-Man the Animated Series the same way again. Before Spider-Man the Animated Series swung onto TV screens in 1994, there were already several attempts to bring Marvel's beloved wall crawler to animated life. And while each had its charm, or let's be real, its quirks, none made quite the same impact. To really appreciate why the 1994 series is still praised by fans and critics alike, you've got to look at how it stood miles above the Spider-Man cartoons that came before, and even many that came after. Let's rewind for a little, because this story actually starts all the way back in 1967.
I'm back!
The original Spider-Man cartoon, known for its bizarre animation cycles and the now infamous Spider-Man pointing meme, was a product of its time. Produced by Grant Trey Lawrence Animation and later by Ralph Bakshi, yes, that Ralph Bakshi, it was cheesy, trippy, and loaded with recycled footage. But despite its limitations, it introduced kids to Spidey's Rogues Gallery and that unforgettable theme song. You know the one. But was it good? Well, it was memorable. Jump to 1981, and we get Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, a show that felt more like an Avengers warm-up than a pure Spider-Man story. Joined by Iceman and Firestar, Spidey battled villains in a shared dorm room that turned into a high-tech command center. The show leaned heavily into camp and often sidelined Peter Parker's internal struggles in favor of team dynamics. Fun? Sure. Deep? Not really. By the way, there was also another Spider-Man cartoon in 1981 that lasted 2 years instead of 3 years like this one. Confusing, huh? Then came Spider-Man the Animated Series in 1994, and suddenly, things changed. This version took everything fans loved about the comics, like Peter's constant internal battles, his complicated relationships, his evolution as a hero, and brought them to life in a serialized, layered, and sometimes even philosophical way.
Peter, I miss Michael so much. This is tearing me up inside.
I feel terrible. It was my blood that turned him into a vampire.
It wasn't just a cartoon anymore. It was a journey, and it dared to grow up with its viewers. One major difference, the storytelling. Earlier shows were episodic, meaning you could jump in at any point and not miss much. But the 94 version was serialized, with episodes that connected to a larger narrative story. A decision that at the time was almost unheard of in kids' animation. It meant that actions had consequences, characters evolved, stories mattered. You weren't just tuning in for a one-off fight, you were watching a full-on character saga. And let's talk animation. While the 1994 series wasn't perfect, we'll get into those production constraints later. It was way more ambitious than its predecessors. The use of CGI for city backgrounds, while clunky by today's standards, was revolutionary for its time, and it gave the show a distinctive look that felt fresh and dynamic. Then there's voice acting. Previous Spider-Man were often a little flat or hooky, but Christopher Daniel Barnes delivered a Peter Parker who was smart, funny, emotional, and painfully human. His voice gave weight to Spidey's internal monologues, something no other show had done with such emotional resonance before. And let's not ignore the tone. The 1967 and 1981 versions rarely got serious, but the 94 series, it tackled loss, betrayal, sacrifice, and even existential crises. Some episodes, like Neogenic Nightmare, veered into body horror territory, showing Peter's slow mutation into a literal spider. Kids were tuning in for web slinging, but they ended up grappling with deep fears about identity and control.
I'm so scared I may start biting my fingernails. And man, have I got fingernails.
Oh, and one more thing. This series treated its villains like real characters. Gone were the mustache-twirling cartoon bad guys. Instead, we got tragic backstories, sympathetic motives, conflicted choices. The show took time to explore why these villains became who they were and how Peter was often just one wrong choice away from becoming them. So, when people say Spider-Man the animated series is the best, they're not just being nostalgic. They're remembering the first time an animated superhero show made them feel something. It wasn't just a silly cartoon noise, it was storytelling with stakes. And sure, later shows like Spectacular Spider-Man and Ultimate Spider-Man brought their own flavor to the table. Spectacular is praised for its sleek animation and tight writing. Ultimate leaned more into comedy and fourth wall breaking, but neither achieved the same mythic status as the '94 series. It's the one that brought the Spider-Verse to TV before it was even a thing. It gave us crossovers, multiverse madness, and emotional closure in a way that other Spider-Man shows still struggle to replicate. And the biggest enemy Peter Parker faced, it wasn't the Green Goblin, it was the censors. But let's start with something most fans completely missed: the truth about why Peter Parker could never throw a real punch. Let me ask you something. Did you ever notice that Spider-Man never actually hit anyone in an entire run of the show? That's right. In 65 episodes, our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man doesn't land a single punch, not one. And it wasn't some creative decision to make Peter seem more peaceful or heroic. Nope, it was censorship.
Don't touch her!
Spider-Man, you're making a career of interference.
Some career. No salary, no vacation. Don't talk about on-the-job health hazards.
Brutal, overreaching censorship by Fox Kids and the infamous BS&P, broadcast standards and practices. These folks didn't just review the episodes for appropriate content, they controlled them. And one of their top rules? No punching, no real violence, no realistic guns, and don't even think about breaking glass. The idea was to protect kids from imitating what they saw on screen. But in the process, they forced the creators to contort fight scenes into weird webs of dodging, swinging, and dramatic grunting. Spider-Man could throw people, trap them in webs, or slam them in the walls, but he couldn't ball up a fist and connect. And the rules didn't stop there. Want to know what other totally ridiculous rules were in place? Wait until you hear about what Spider-Man wasn't allowed to say, or even imply. So if you're already annoyed that Spider-Man couldn't fight like a real superhero, get ready to lose it. Because the censorship board didn't stop at physical violence. They also slammed the door shut on entire themes, phrases, and even words. And this is where things start to get really strange. No one in the show was allowed to say the word kill. That means Spider-Man couldn't say, "I'll kill you." He was killed, or even, "This could kill someone." They had to use watered-down alternatives like destroyed, eliminated, or taken out, making life or death moments feel awkward.
Enough! Game time's over. I owe you big time, punk!
Remember our deal. He's yours after I'm done with him.
But here's where it gets even more absurd. Vampires weren't allowed to bite people. Let that sink in. When they introduced Morbius, the living vampire, they had to completely rework his origin. Instead of feeding on blood, Morbius was rewritten to crave plasma and suck it out of people using suction cups on his hands. That wasn't just a weird choice, it was a direct result of censorship, and it completely changed who Morbius was. The result? One of the creepiest, most unintentionally disturbing character redesigns in 90s animation history. And speaking of disturbing, just wait until you hear what happened when the creators tried to tell a real story about loss and grief. The kind of story that would have brought Spider-Man's journey full circle. They tried, but Fox wouldn't let them go there. And the fallout? It nearly broke the entire writing team. Uncle Ben is the core of Spider-Man's mythology. He's the reason Peter becomes a hero. His death is the emotional anchor of the entire franchise. But in Spider-Man the Animated Series, Ben's story was pushed to the side, barely mentioned, and painfully underdeveloped. Why? Because the network wouldn't allow them to show him being shot, even in flashbacks, even off-screen, even in silhouette. It was a no-go. No guns, no blood, no death scenes. Showrunner John Semper Jr. wanted to explore Peter's guilt and trauma more deeply. He wanted to build a meaningful story that dealt with grief in a real way, but Fox said no, over and over and over again. So instead, we got vague flashbacks and cryptic dialogue that hinted at Uncle Ben's fate, but never gave it the emotional weight it deserved. But here's the craziest part. In the final season, Semper finally found a way to bring Uncle Ben back in one of the most mind-bending, fourth-wall-breaking episodes of any super cartoon ever. And what happened next? The ending of the series completely imploded. And to this day, fans are still asking, why was there never a season 6? The final episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series is one of the weirdest endings in cartoon history. Peter meets a version of Stan Lee, travels through alternate realities, and then sets off to find Mary Jane, who had mysteriously vanished earlier in the show.
I don't believe it. Mary Jane. It's me, Peter.
Sorry, but I was wandering around. I heard some noise.
Oh, I'm so happy to have found you at last.
Whoa, handsome.
That's right. The main love interest had disappeared, and Peter's big happy ending is literally him swinging off into the unknown to search for her. No reunion, no confirmation, just goodbye. What happened? Well, behind the scenes, things were falling apart. The writing team had been burned out. Semper had fought tooth and nail to keep the series coherent through all the censorship, budget limitations, and studio interference. But after season 5, he was done. Fox originally wanted a season 6. They even discussed a Spider-Man 2099 spin-off. But without Semper and with tensions high between the network and Marvel's TV decision, the show just ended. Mary Jane's story was supposed to continue. We were going to get an entire story about Peter finding her, dealing with clones, and confronting deep emotional trauma, but none of that happened. Instead, what we got was a series finale that felt more like a mid-season cliffhanger. And the real heartbreak? Semper never got to finish the story. To this day, he's been open about how much that still bothers him. But wait, it gets worse. Because you know that classic Spider-Man line, "With great power comes great responsibility"? The one that defines the entire character? Guess what? That wasn't even in the show at first. You'd think a phrase like, "with great power comes great responsibility," could be Spider-Man's mission statement, right? Well, it is in the comics, in the movies, in the culture, but not in Spider-Man the Animated Series. Not initially. The show danced around the theme, sure, but for several seasons, the actual line was missing. And there's a reason for that. Fox thought it was too preachy for kids. They didn't want Spider-Man sounding too moralistic. The network feared it would come off as too serious for a children's cartoon.
Who are you?
I punish those who prey on the innocent.
Well, what does that have to do with me?
You kidnapped that student.
Eventually, Semper fought hard enough that they let him include it, but only in a handful of episodes, and usually in a subtle way. So one of the most iconic quotes in comic book history was almost cut completely because executives were afraid it might be too deep. But deep is what Semper wanted. He envisioned Spider-Man as a young man dealing with impossible choices, trauma, and responsibility in ways kids could understand. And for a while, he was winning that fight. Until a Disney princess walked into the studio and changed the show forever. Okay, here's where things get really wild. During production, John Semper and his team worked tirelessly to create compelling stories. They were finally gaining momentum in their later seasons. But then a new executive came in, someone who had just come off working on The Little Mermaid. According to Semper, she didn't get Spider-Man. She reportedly wanted the show to be softer, more like a fairy tale. She pushed for Peter and Mary Jane to have more romantic drama, less action, more melodrama. Semper was stunned.
I've come to take you home, Mary Jane.
Peter, you don't understand. My father is here. Brother Mordo has reunited us. I see Daddy every day.
This was Spider-Man, not Ariel and Prince Eric. But the exec had power, and suddenly storylines were being rewritten. Scenes were cut. Entire episodes were reshaped to tone things down. It was the beginning of the end. But while all that was still going on, something even weirder was happening. Fans started noticing something strange about the way characters moved. It felt off. And there's a disturbing reason for that too. One that had nothing to do with the story and everything to do with money. If you've ever watched Spider-Man the animated series and thought, why does this scene look weirdly stiff? You're not alone. The animation was wildly inconsistent. Some episodes looked fantastic, others looked like they were animated by someone asleep at a desk. And that's because the show was outsourced to different studios across the globe, most notably to cheap overseas animation houses in Korea and Japan. Some of them did solid work, others were rushed, underfunded, and completely overwhelmed. In some cases, action scenes had to be reanimated or completely re-edited. There are even scenes where characters float, mouths move out of sync, and poses look like mannequins. The worst offender? An early season where animated was so bad, it had to be fixed frame by frame before airing. That's how bad it got. And you know what's crazy? The music. Something most people overlook was the one thing that consistently held it all together. But even that has its own disturbing backstory. Remember that iconic techno rock opening? The one that screams Spider-Man with distorted guitars and glitchy vocals? That was revolutionary for cartoons during that time, and it was the brainchild of Joe Perry, guitarist of Aerosmith. That's right, a rock legend helped define the sound of Spider-Man for an entire generation. But here's the shocking part. Joe Perry was hired not because they wanted him, but because Marvel was desperate to draw attention to the show. The idea was, if they could put a famous name on the soundtrack, they could generate more buzz and convince Nervous Network execs that the show was cool enough for older kids. And it worked. Perry's involvement helped secure attention and, more importantly, ratings. But here's the kicker. The rest of the show's music was composed under incredibly tight deadlines. In some cases, composers had 48 hours to finish scoring entire episodes. Yet, despite that, the soundtrack became one of the most underrated elements of the entire series. And now, we've come to the final twist. The darkest secret of them all. The one thing that almost killed the show before it even aired. And it all started with Marvel going bankrupt. In the mid-1990s, Marvel Comics was on the brink of total collapse. The comic book market had crashed, sales were plummeting, and Marvel filed for bankruptcy in 1996, right in the middle of Spider-Man's TV run. That meant budgets were slashed, staff were laid off, planned projects were frozen, and the long-rumored Season 6 completely scrapped. Even worse, the financial turmoil created friction between Marvel and Fox. At one point, Fox didn't even want to promote the show anymore because they weren't sure if Marvel could deliver future episodes. The final season was rushed, the animation cut corners, and the production team was told without ceremony that there would be no continuation. Spider-Man's greatest adventure had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet collapse behind the scenes. And that's the real tragedy. Because if you peel back the layers of censorship, animation chaos, corporate sabotage, and burnout, what you find underneath is a show that was fighting to be great. And in many ways, it still was. Spider-Man the Animated Series was more than just a kid's show. It was a miracle of storytelling in a time when superhero animation was still finding its voice. It battled through red tape, studio meddling, and budget disasters, and still gave us one of the most faithful adaptations of Peter Parker ever put on screen. But now that you know the real story, the punches that never landed, the episodes that were never made, the censorship that rewrote characters, you'll never watch it the same way again. So, what do you think? Should they bring this version of Spider-Man back for a proper ending? And did you notice the missing punches or weird animation back in the day? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and swing back here next time because we're just getting started. Until then, keep your web shooters ready, and remember, with great power comes great storytelling. See you next time.